Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shauna Hogan-Moore, and I'm very honored to be here today, to be standing with all of you here at the DNC to give the land acknowledgement. That being said, the DNC Poverty Council would like to acknowledge my six-time great-grandmother, Kitty Hawa of the Potawatomi Nation, who, with her husband, founded this great city of Chicago. They would also like to acknowledge and humbly thank all of the Native peoples on whose land it once was. Indeed, the first true stewards of this land we now gather upon today. This includes the Anishinaabe, which known as the Council of the Three Fires, which includes the Ojibwe, the Odawa, as well as the Potawatomi. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.
All right, give it up for Shauna Hogan-Moore, please. So I'm Susie Shannon. I'm the chair of the Poverty Council. We started this council actually a few years ago right here in Chicago, so it's great to be back here for the convention. I'll let you know, Shauna and I have been best friends since she was 11 years old. And when we met, my family didn't have anywhere to live, and we were living in a very low-cost motel with 4 siblings and my mom, who was a single mom who was raising us. And Shauna lived down the street from us, down the block, and her family had 4 kids and a mom living in a 1-bedroom apartment. So we became very close friends pretty much right away, both the youngest of 5. And so, you know, my life has been really marked by poverty in many parts of my life, in many sections. And before I lived in Los Angeles, I actually lived right here in Chicago on the north side. And when I was in 5th grade, we were living in a different hotel, which was the Holiday Inn. And I remember, you know, going to school and just trying to fit in with everyone. And interestingly enough, in the motel room next to us, there was another family living there. I think it was 6 kids. And we had 5 kids in my family. And I remember going to school, and, you know, like any little girl at 10 years old, I signed up to join the Girl Scouts. And I remember getting the application to fill out the form. And when it had a address on it, I really didn't know what to put. So I just put the address of the motel where we were staying. And we had our first meeting of the Girl Scouts, and the Girl Scout leader said, hey, this Saturday I want everyone to come and help, you know, clean up our space, and, you know, we'll all come and have a good time. And so that Saturday I had my sister walk me over there, and it was closed, like she wasn't there. And so my sister said, well, you should leave a note letting her know that you showed up. So I left a note for her. And I remember we went back to the motel, and the Girl Scout leader had arrived at the place late and then came to find me based on the application and came to the motel. And I remember being very, very embarrassed that she knew that, like, we didn't have a place to live. And I remember the next Girl Scout meeting, you know, she came, so she knew that I lived in a motel and we didn't have any place to live. And the next Girl Scout meeting, she said to everyone, like, I asked everybody to come on Saturday, but the only one who came was Susie. And so I'm going to give her a uniform for free because she came. And I thought that was very sweet. Yeah, I thought that was very sweet. I also was a little embarrassed, to be honest. And I felt, too, like I wanted to blend in, but I really knew that I kind of didn't. Because when you don't have a lot of money and you don't have a place to live, you know it. And the other thing is, you know, not having a place to live was not great, obviously, and you kind of try to hide it, and there's always this fear that you're going to be taken away from your mom. The other thing is hunger, and it's very important that we talk about that, because I know that 3 times in my life there was no food. like just no food. And it was awful, and I really thought as a little kid I was going to starve to death. And it was probably very exaggerated because when you're a little kid, you do tend to do that. But I know that, when I was 10, and we were living in this motel on the north side of Chicago, my sister got a job at Arby's downtown, right around the corner from the water tower, which was a double-decker Arby's, had 2 floors. And we would wait at night for my sister to come back with like roast beef and cheddar sandwiches so that we had something to eat in my family. And I know other people, including elected officials, who have grown up in poverty, and they worked at pizza places so they could bring food home to their family. They worked at fast food places so they could do that too. And I'm just saying that this is really why I founded the Poverty Council here at the DNC, because a lot of people self-censor poverty if they're living in poverty. And that self-censorship, I think, has really hurt people, because if we don't have a place where we can tell our stories, if we don't have a place where we're telling these stories to elected officials and people who are making a difference out there, and writing legislation, passing legislation, and making sure that they're talking to people with lived experience so they can really hear these stories and not just a bunch of numbers, I think that that's significant. I think that's important. And I don't think the Republican Party is doing anything to help people in poverty. I think it's right here in the Democratic Party. And I always say, people who live in poverty typically don't have a union. They have the Democratic Party. And it is so important that we keep pushing here in the party to make sure that our elected officials are focused on helping low-income renters, on helping kids who currently live in motels, which is an astounding number of children. I mean, just in the LA Unified School District, there's over 25,000 children who are homeless. When you think about that, it's really, really shocking. So I just want to say this is an extremely important election, as all of us know. When you look at what the Trump administration did during the time that he was president, wanting to cut our Section 8 vouchers to almost zero, trying to cut food programs, and just not caring about low-income people, it is absolutely critical that we not let the Trump administration, or Trump win, first of all, or the Trump administration take over again, because they will decimate these budgets for poverty programs and for low-income folks. And I just want to say, Kamala Harris has come out for rent control, and she will get our back. There's no doubt about it, I will tell you. But even, President Biden in January made history by talking about rent control, by needing a 5% rent cap, and by going after our corporate landlords who have been cheating, they have been price fixing, they've been using a platform called RealPage to raise rents in every neighborhood, and people are ending up unhoused, they're ending up living in motels, they're ending up living in streets. Just in the state of California, we have 181,000 people who are unhoused, if you can even imagine that. And over 700,000 now actually across the United States who are unhoused. And we desperately need to elect somebody who is going to address all of these problems with compassion and with real solutions. So I hope, we're all in the Democratic Party. I'm sure everybody's voting for Kamala Harris, but outside of that, please work as hard as you can, because, there are other little girls who are out there, and, I feel like, I am okay, obviously now, financially, but there are other little girls out there who are living in motels too, and, probably embarrassed because they don't have a place to live. So I want you to help get their back by helping. So I will end it there. I'm going to bring up our first speaker, who is Christian Nunes. Christian is like one of the most amazing people that I know. She is the president of the National Organization for Women. She's our vice chair here for the Poverty Council. And she has done extraordinary work already, particularly on poverty issues around women and children. And she is my hero, and I'm so excited to bring her up. And she's a surrogate, too, for the Kamala Harris campaign.
Good afternoon, everyone. Are y'all excited today? But I don't feel it in this room. Are you excited today? Okay. Because this is a very historical, important day. I know standing here as a Black woman, as a Black mother, as a social worker, as the president of the National Organization for Women, who has endorsed every single woman who's run for president, starting with Shirley Chisholm, and given her, starting with Shirley Chisholm, right? When no one favored her, National Organization for Women now endorsed her. Back then in 1972, right? And I remember one of the most important things Shirley Chisholm said, I think is so important, and it resonates today with what we're experiencing. And I'm gonna tie this into what we're talking about when we talk about poverty, because it's so important in economic security. She said that she was not a candidate for Black America. She was Black and she was proud. And she said she was not a candidate for women, although she worked in the women's movement and she was a woman and she was equally proud of being a woman. And she said she was not a candidate for any political bosses or fat cats or special interest groups, but she stands here without endorsements from many big political groups. And she did not intend to offer out any glib cliches, which for too long have been accepted by political life. She said she is a candidate for the people of America. And my presence before you now symbolizes a new era in American political history. I think 52 years later, that's what we're seeing, we're experiencing. We are experiencing two candidates who stand for the American people. And we're experiencing two candidates who understand what the experience is like for many of us in our lives who did not grow up with wealth or legacy or silver spoons. We are experiencing those who actually had to work. And so when we look at what's happening in this country, we have to also have an honest conversation about that. We have to have an honest conversation that there is going to be work to do. And it's not just their work to do, it's also our work to do in this, right? So when we think about it, we think about the statistics of what's happening, especially with women. Women are the main groups that are experiencing the most poverty, women and children. Children, the poverty rate for children has doubled in the last year. We know when we have the child tax credit, it helped cut poverty in half. But when the child tax credit was trying to be extended, we had many MAGA Republicans who refused to help increase the extension. And so here we are seeing poverty increase again because we were refusing to give children back their benefits that they needed to have a meal. So we have to think about also as well that the gender wage gap creates economic insecurity for many women. Right now, women earn on average, well, not even on average, 83 cents on the white man's dollar. And I say white man's dollar because there's gender wage gap for men as well. And when you look at persons of color, women of color, then we look at the fact that Black women earn 64 cents, Latino women earn 57 cents, and women with disabilities only earn 46 cents on the dollar. How disappointing and discouraging is that? So when you look at that, that adds up to hundreds of thousands of dollars. It adds up years of times it takes you to be able to catch up. And then we're expecting people to be able to say, well, just get up, do it, you can handle it. No, we cannot. But we have right now two candidates who are willing to fight for economic security, who are willing to help with affordable housing, who are willing to work to increase child tax credit, who are willing to actually do their best to make sure that they are providing safety, social security safety nets for children and families, so they are not having to decide, do I pay my rent or do I eat a meal? Because that's what a lot of people are facing right now. We don't want people to just have to survive out of chaos. We want people to thrive. Don't you all want to thrive? Okay. So that's what we're trying to get right now, and that's what's really important. And so we have to make sure that we also are investing in candidates, not only the presidential and vice president candidates, Harris and Walz, but we also have to make sure we're investing in candidates who believe in people thriving up and down the ballot. Because what happens in your homes and your communities has just as much importance to what's affecting your life. We have to invest in people who believe in our ability to grow and not live in poverty anymore. Poverty is rooted in systematic racism. It's rooted in misogyny, it's rooted in white supremacy, it's rooted in white patriarchy. These are systems that we have to dismantle and disrupt, okay? But we have to do this together. And we have a team who's trying to do this for us. So it's our work to get out there and mobilize and organize and make sure we get them to the finish line. Are you all gonna help us get them to the finish line? And as we heard throughout this week, we have to do something, we have to continue, we have to stop, take a pause, get back out and do something. We cannot stop because it matters. We have to look for our legacy, which is our children, and make sure that they have the things that can make them live and not have to worry. And our families live and not have to worry, and you not have to worry all the time. And that is what Madam Vice President Kamala Harris and Governor Coach Tim Walz will bring for us. So I just encourage us all to remember that although it's gonna be a road, this road can change. This narrative can change, but we have to change it together, okay? Thank you.
All right, give it up for Christian Nunes. Okay, our next speaker is a local organizer, and he is the executive director of the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization. Please welcome Shannon Bennett.
Thank you, Susie, and thank you all for attending this Poverty Council convening. I think we all know this moment is so special, and being here in our hometown of Chicago, anybody who's in Chicago, and we're so proud because we know people know what we produce, right? We produce some of the strongest leaders, some of the folk that have come out of poverty, some of the people who lifted themselves up along with the support and overcome odds that we have never, seen people do. So I just want to say at this moment, we all know this is special, right? Secondly, I think the work of talking about poverty has to start and has to continue with those people most impacted. So one of the things that we always say, those closest to the pain need to be closest to the power. And what that does, it creates an atmosphere of bottoms up, and it's not rhetoric. For years we've heard about that, but the grass tops need to be pushed from the roots of the people who are most impacted. That's where the best solutions come from. That's where the best solutions come from. So here in Chicago, I'm gonna take a little minute to give you all a scope and talk about the landscape of what's happening in Chicago, but it's just like other urban cities. And I'll be remiss also if we don't talk about the similarities and commonalities we have with our rural brothers and sisters. So I met someone after our Tuesday conversation that really lifted up the connectivity that we must have about what happens in urban cities and also what happens in rural America. Because the two are usually looked at in silos, but what a great thing if we start getting our leaders to see the connectivity. What a great thing if we start to lift up each other's issues and we carry them like they're our own, because they are. The opioid crisis is tearing and just ravishing different rural areas, but don't you know we have a heroin epidemic in Chicago, in LA, in Philly? These are things that sometimes we're taught to just see in the little silos and say, okay, it's only going to happen, it's only happening over here. One of the things that we know is that some big cities transport models. Sometimes they're models of poverty. Sometimes they're models of privatization. Chicago has been hit with some of the largest privatization of public schools and public education in the country. We were ground zero. Charter schools decided to just, not just decided, but privatizers decided, along with elected officials, to start turn over public institutions and act as though they were private. Who's heard of something in housing called RAD? That's a project, a federal project, that is allowing privatizers to own public housing. It starts off first as management of public housing. So if you haven't heard about RAD, it's probably in your city, if you're in, especially one of the big cities, but it's coming to you. That happened under different administrations, but I think we have to challenge those processes when they affect us locally differently than people who think they might be good intention, but locally a lot of these policies. So here we are in Chicago. Chicago, black folk used to be 52% of the population. We're now barely at 30, under that. Chicago's a third. The area that black folk migrated to in this city called the Black Belt, or an area called Bronzeville in the 50s and 60s, was thriving because the population was really segregated and most of the resources stayed in one area, but people worked together. You had doctors living next door to teachers. You had professional entertainers living in this area. It was called the Black Harlem. It still is looked as that way, of Chicago. Now that's the area that I work in and organize in. And some of the issues that we organize in and around are some of the same issues that Dr. King saw when he came to Chicago. People know that he was quoted as saying Chicago, he's never seen some of this racism that he saw when he marched through Marquette Park here in Chicago that he's seen in the Deep South. He talked about the deep segregation of Chicago. If anybody knows anything about Chicago, Chicago has been deeply segregated, and some of the policies and some of the structures were intentionally done to sabotage the lives of people. And what I talk about, and we talked about before, is that some of the systems are working just like they were intended. Some of the education systems are undereducating our kids. That's intentional because they weren't made for those kids. Some of the systems around employment and things like that. So where we are now in Chicago, we are struggling like many urban cities with gentrification, with these privatizers, with these corporate landlords. So one of the things Susie referenced is that there's time for a national rent control policy. It's overdue. You can call it rent control, which we like to say. You can call it rent regulation. You can whatever fancy name you want to come up with, because some people are scared to say rent control. We know it's been around for a while. Is it a silver bullet? No. But is it a part of a toolkit that we can use to push back on people who have no intention of us existing in these communities? When people ask where the people, the 20-some thousand people, well, the units, 25,000 people, that units that live in those units, the people, where did they go? From Chicago Housing Authority? People were transported by Chicago policymakers into Iowa City, Iowa. Black folk who had never been in places like that. That was something that was supported by taxpayer dollars. Where are we now? We have, if you go around Chicago, if you leave, just go a few blocks, you'll see some of this vacant land that used to house people. People sometimes look at it only as units. No, we know the people. So those were people that lived there. They have still not returned after demolition of their homes some 24 years ago. So that's a crime. And we look at it like it's high time that local politicians, along with federal and folk, come together and talk about the policies that the people demand. Because people power is what has changed this nation and has changed this world. Most movements start on the ground with the people. So we have the answers. I bet you if I ask anybody where you're from and things like that, you could tell me about a solution that you know would work in your local area. We all know the solutions, but sometimes the people that we need to hear them the most aren't always listening, but we know how to make them listen, don't we? We know how to make them listen. So that's real democracy. So I'll just end with one thing just to share with you about Chicago story, just want you all to know. Chicago, of course, we know has some of the best food in the world. Have you had a chance to eat some of our food, right? We also have some of the best people in the world. We're in the center, and that means something because people migrate to Chicago, especially now, the melting pot of what Chicago is now, and you get a chance to get the feel of a big city with a small town hospitality. That's what Chicago is. The city of broad shoulders, and then also a city that has endured transition from the founder and the Passamaquoddy and the land that we live on, we're on right now. We have an opportunity to keep those legacies alive, and we're glad you're here. But just hear more about this story, because I think it's an American story, and that we need to make sure that the folks who are going to be running this country as our next president and vice president hear from us, right? So we got it. So we can do this. So I just want to thank you all, and enjoy your time here, and get some of that good food, all right? Take care.
Thank you. All right, Shannon Bennett. Okay, we have another local community organizer, Saru Jayaraman from One Fair Wage. Oh, I'm not sure. Oh, okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah, I'm not a local organizer. I lead a national organization called One Fair Wage. We are 300,000 restaurant and service workers across the country. We represent the 14 million restaurant workers in the United States of America. And we've got a huge fight on our hands. You have been hearing about no taxes on tips in the news, and 2/3 of tipped workers do not earn enough to pay federal income tax. So that is not the solution that we need. We need one fair wage, livable wages for everybody in the United States of America. And let me talk to you a little bit about how this is moving with incredible momentum, and why we need the campaign to uplift this issue and elevate it in the same way they're talking about other aspects of things, because it is polling as the absolute top highest concern for Black voters, Latinx voters, and young voters is the cost of living and jobs with living wages. So I've been doing this work for 22 years. I'm also a professor at UC Berkeley. I've written 5 books on this issue. The restaurant industry is the largest and fastest growing private sector employer in the United States of America, with 14 million workers. Unfortunately, is also the absolute lowest paying employer, largely due to the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers, which is still an outrageous, unconscionable $2.13 an hour at the federal level in 2024. Not for a tiny little smidgen or marginalized group of workers, but for the largest employer of women, young people, people of color, immigrants, formerly incarcerated people in the United States of America. How many people here ever worked in the restaurant industry? You told a story of your family. Pretty much everybody has either themselves or family members worked in the industry. It is an enormous, fast-growing industry, and yet it continues to be the absolute lowest paying because of an ugly history and an ongoing political influence of a corporate trade lobby called the National Restaurant Association, which we call the other NRA, that unfortunately has too much influence over both parties, and I am going to be very real here. Before emancipation, waiters in the United States were mostly white men. In 1853, they went on strike for higher wages. They did not get tips prior to emancipation. Tipping was not prevalent in the United States at the time. When they went on strike, restaurants started looking for cheaper labor. At first, they found it in white women. After emancipation, they started hiring Black workers, Black women in particular, telling them, we're not going to pay you any wage. You're going to live on this new thing that's come from Europe called a tip. There were 2 industries that did this, and this all started right here in Chicago. The Pullman Train Company was a large train, luxury train company hiring Black men, calling them all George, telling them, we're not going to pay you, you're going to live on tips of the people whose baggage you carry. Restaurant workers were Black women who were told, we're not going to pay you, you're going to live on tips, as a way for these 2 industries to continue to access free Black labor. The Pullman car porters started organizing, as hopefully most of you know, under the leadership of A. Philip Randolph, and won the right to an actual wage, one fair wage, rather than living on tips. In response to their organizing, the National Restaurant Association was formed. We call it the other NRA. And it started demanding that their workers, Black women, never get what the Black men in the Pullman trains got, which was an actual wage. In fact, in 1938, when everybody got the right to a federal minimum wage under the New Deal, Tipped workers, who are mostly black women, were excluded and told, you get zero, you get nothing. And we went from $0 in 1938 all the way up to the extraordinary $2.13 an hour in 2024 for the nation's largest employer of women, people of color, immigrants, and you name it, young people, all because of a trade lobby called the other NRA. Over the last 22 years that I have been fighting to raise wages in this industry and organize workers, worker-led, we're a worker-led organization, as the gentleman just said. We totally agree that those most impacted have to lead, which they do in our organization. We have been fighting for 22 years to raise this wage, to end the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. It has been an extraordinarily hard fight because the Restaurant Association wields enormous power over elected officials of all parties. And they have been incredible bullies. They put my children's pictures up on attack websites. They follow us around the country. They doxed me. They sent me a prowler to my house. I have a stalker that I had to get a restraining order against. They send me death threats because they do not want to pay more than $2.13 an hour anywhere in the country. But with the pandemic, everything has started to change. With the pandemic, 6 million restaurant workers lost their jobs. 2/3 were told they were paid too little in order to qualify for unemployment insurance. They couldn't get unemployment insurance because they were too poor. Then they went back to work before it was safe. The CDC named restaurants the most dangerous place to be during the pandemic. 12,000 restaurant workers died. No, 12,000 restaurant workers were murdered because they were forced to go back to work before it was safe because they did not get unemployment insurance because they were told they were too poor. For those that survived, they reported that tips went down, harassment went up. We already have the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry because it's largely women having to put up with so much from customers to get tips. But during the pandemic, it got so much worse. Women reported, I'm regularly asked, take off your mask so I can see how cute you are before I decide how much to tip you. Take off your mask so I can see the pretty face of my server before I decide how much to tip. We called that masculine harassment because it was so pervasive. We heard it from so many thousands of women. We said enough is enough. Women started walking off the job en masse. In fact, during and after the pandemic, 1.2 million restaurant workers left the industry, saying, take your job and shove it. They said, we've gotten to the point where we cannot afford to work in these jobs anymore. The cost of living is so high that the gas to get to work is literally 3 times my hourly wage. Why would I pay 3 times my wage to get to work to earn 1/3 of what I just paid in gas to get there? And so they started leaving en masse. It created a moment of worker power, the likes of which we have not seen since emancipation. Thousands of restaurants have had to raise wages to recruit and retain staff, and we started winning. In November 2022, we won one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top, a 300% wage increase for tipped workers in our nation's capital, Washington, D.C. And then last October, the gentleman is right, organizers here are incredible. Last October 2023, we made Chicago the largest city in the United States to independently end this legacy of slavery, the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers. We won a 50% increase for 100,000 workers here in the city of Chicago in October. But the biggest victory just happened 2 weeks ago, July 31st. Michigan just became the 8th state in the union and the first state east of the Mississippi to end the sub-minimum wage for tip workers, raising wages for 1.2 million workers by 300%. Let me ask you something. Have you heard about this in the news? 1.2 million workers just got a raise in a battleground state. Why isn't this coming out of the mouths of every politician running this year? Why aren't we all talking about the top issue that's on the top of every poll, the cost of living and jobs with living wages? There has been a lot of talk about costs, reducing costs. I am glad to hear there's talk of rent control, great talk about price gouging, wonderful talk about, prescription drug prices and yes, costs, yes. But for working people, there are 2 sides of the coin. The cost of things and your ability to pay for things. Because the rent is too damn high, yes, but the pay is too damn low as well. So we need We don't just need to get rid of taxes on tips. We need to raise that federal minimum wage and specify that we need to end the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers now. It is moving in states across the country. Rep. Horsford from Nevada, who's the person who elevated the no tax on tips, is introducing a bill in 2 weeks that would end the sub-minimum wage for tipped workers and get rid of taxes on tips. Everybody, including Kamala Harris, should be standing behind that bill. Thank you.
All right, give it up for Saru. Our next speaker needs no introduction, but I will tell you that Congressmember Barbara Lee is a hero for working class folks, for people who live in poverty. She started the Out of Poverty Caucus in Congress. She has been a leader on all of these issues for decades, and we are so excited to have her here today. Please welcome Congressmember Barbara Lee.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you, Susie. Thank you so much for your leadership and keeping hope alive, because it's so often, and I love to always mention this, that this party, as much as I am committed to the Democratic Party, I've always fought for it to be more inclusive, more democratic, and also to raise the issues that oftentimes we don't raise. And we have to fight and grow the middle class. That's a given. We have to do that and keep saying it. But we also have to use the P word. And we have to use that we want to lift people out of poverty also. And in order to grow the middle class, and in order to make sure everyone has a chance at the American dream, we have to lift millions of people out of poverty into the middle class. We have so many low-income people, working people who live below the poverty line, who have to rely on SNAP and Section 8, and all of the safety net and budget allocations that we provide as a member of the Appropriations Committee and Budget Committee. And so I want to thank you all, because what you're doing is making sure Democrats use the P word, and we have to say poverty. And I'm really proud of course, our next president, Kamala Harris, for using the P word. She's talked about child poverty and the earned income tax credit and lifting children out of poverty. And so we have to keep talking about that, and how she, and I know her, I've known her over 3 decades, how she has always fought for and doesn't shy away from addressing issues of low-income people, poor people, people who deserve to be seen by their government. Also, our Vice President, Tim Walz, you know, he, during his first term, and you probably know his record with passing legislation for free lunch programs for children, establishing paid leave. He banned non-compete agreements for workers, established the nation-led child tax credit in Minnesota to cut child poverty by 1/3. And so, you know, be hopeful, and I know you are, but we've got to do the work that needs to be done between now and November. When you look at people who are living on the streets, unsheltered, you know, you haven't heard many presidential candidates talking about housing. This is a big issue in every single state. I come from Oakland and Berkeley, California. The cost of living is off the scale, and part of the reason and the driver for this cost of living being so high, where ordinary working men and women, low-income people, poor people can't afford to live in my district, is because of housing. And, you know, until we address the housing crisis, we're not going to be able to really address lifting people out of poverty. Just a couple of statistics. In 2023, 653,000 people were experiencing homelessness on any single night in the month. That's a shame and disgrace in the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world. That's a 12% increase from 2022. And nearly 4 in 10 people experiencing homelessness are identified as black people. People who identified as black make up 13% of the U.S. population, but comprise 37% of all people experiencing homelessness. So there's a racial equity issue and a racial justice issue in our overall housing policies. It's a moral failure. It's a moral disgrace. And so in response, again, elections have consequences. This extremist corporate-controlled Supreme Court, they have criminalized homelessness, criminalized it. More than 44 million people in the U.S., they face hunger, including 1 in 5 children. And so what do Republicans do in response? They try to cut the food assistance program funding. And while the Biden-Harris administration cut child poverty in half by, as you know, enhancing the child tax credit, Republicans decided, and this is something, I'm on the Appropriations Committee, they tried to and did decide to ignore the data and discontinue the program. And so I've worked alongside Congresswoman, and we need to remember her work on lifting people out of poverty, Congresswoman Lucille Roybal Allard, to commission the National Academy of Science in a historic landmark report on child poverty reduction, which contributed to and was the driver of the expansion of the program. And so elections do matter. Again, let me close by just saying I know what Project 2025 is about because I have seen it before the Appropriations Committee and the Budget Committee for several years now. Fortunately now, it's public. We've been fighting in the Probes and Budget Committee to beat back all of these amendments that would take us way back to the days that I don't want to even think about, but part of their Project 2025, and I know you know this, Shannon. Excuse me, Shannon. That the report would put more people into poverty. And so read those sections of the 2025 Project 2025 and see what they want to do. And so we have no option this year. We have no option but to work with all of our groups who are fighting to end poverty, fighting to make sure that everyone in this country shares in the wealth of America, and make sure that everyone has a safe and decent place to live. So thank you again for your leadership, and thank you for inviting me to be with you for a minute. I know Congressman Danny Davis will be here shortly. He's running a bit late. Things, as you know, are a little busy too, but really thank you for inviting me here. Thank you all again.
So I want to thank Barbara Lee as well for standing up to help create this Poverty Council here at the DNC. We had a little bit of trouble starting this council, and Barbara Lee stood up on the floor of one of our DNC meetings. She goes, I want to know why the Poverty Council isn't on the agenda. And ever since then, we've been agendized.
But it's been Susie Shannon that's carried the ball forward. So.
Okay, we have one question.
Yeah, Trump's agenda, really. Oh, boy. No, yeah. And there's an executive summary. I know it's online. Yeah. But read. But it's. Yeah. Okay. But just know it's here. Okay. Thank you, Susie Shannon.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Wonderful. Okay, I'm bringing up another local community organizer. Thank you. G2 Brown is the National Director for the Journey for Justice Alliance. G2? Okay. He's talking Barbara Lee. So hold on for just a second. Sure. Yeah. Have a what? I don't know what Promise 2025 means. We have a platform that includes rent control and housing as a human right, and a lot of those issues that you can look at online. Yeah. Check out our DNC platform. I think it's like 124 pages. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Let's try that again. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, thank you. Welcome to Chicago. My name is G2 Brown. I'm a proud son of the Kenwood Oakland Community Organization with my brother Jalita Bennett. We have been organizers since I was 30 pounds lighter with no gray in my beard, right? And if I understand everything correctly, I want to start this piece with a quote by Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple. She said, "No one is your friend who demands your silence or denies your right to grow." And what has happened in Chicago is that for every right we have, we've had to claw and scratch because we have been unheard. The institutions that most Americans take for granted, a hospital, a decent school, a grocery store, our systematic affordable housing, are systematically denied our communities. My brother Bennett talked a little bit earlier about the fact that you all were in Bronzeville. I want to piggyback on that a little bit. When Ida B. Wells was running from lynch mobs in Memphis, Tennessee, the policy kings, because the lottery started in Chicago, the black policy kings shepherded that sister to safety on 35th and King Drive, and she lived the rest of her life. When John Coltrane and Ella Fitzgerald would come and perform, and they couldn't stay in the hotels downtown, they slept at the Sutherland Ballroom on 47th Street. Sam Cooke is from Bronzeville. Gwendolyn Brooks is from Bronzeville. Minnie Riperton is from Bronzeville. Richard Wright is from Bronzeville. The first black hospital ever built in the United States, Providence Hospital, by Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, the first man to perform successful surgery on the human heart, is in Bronzeville. But how, in this glorious community, was black male unemployment at 50%? Why, in this community, did we have when me and Jalita started organizing, we had the third highest rate of vacant lots in the United States, some of the highest infant morbidity rates in the world? It is because the way you build community is that you invest in basic quality of life institutions. Institutions teach your people how to be treated. If you want to destroy a community, you kill those institutions. So whether you go to Oakland, Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Baltimore, the basic quality of life institutions that we fought to have in our community have been denied us. Nowhere is that more evident than education. In 1986, there was a conference called the Chicago Education Conference with former Mayor Harold Washington. And a noble idea was created called local school councils. It said local site management works best. People at schools should be able to govern those individual schools. For 5 straight years after the creation of local school councils, the Iowa test of basic skill scores went up. 5 straight years. Then former Mayor Daley invented an education crisis. And Chicago became the second city in 1995 to go in mayoral control. They brought a gentleman in named Paul Vallis to run the schools. He started he opened a bunch of selective enrollment schools, which pulled the highest performing children out of the schools, and then said that the neighborhood schools that were left were failing. That sounds like a setup to you, don't it? Then he put those schools on academic probation. You're bad schools. And if you don't do better, we're going to close them. And then Arnie Duncan comes. And they've closed over 160 schools in this city. I'm going to ask you to listen to me with your heart for a second, because you may not live this experience. I want to say this. Over 300,000 people that look like me have been purged out of this city since the year 2000 by the sabotage of our basic quality of life institutions. Raise your hand if you've never experienced a slumlord. You've never lived it. Be honest. If you've never lived under a slumlord, raise your hand. Raise your hand if the liquor store is not your grocery store in your neighborhood. Raise your hand. Raise your hand as at a child you were never roughed up by the police as a child. That was not your lived experience. Raise your hand if you've never seen anybody shot before. Raise your hand if you had a hospital in your childhood. That's not the reality for many of our communities. That's not the reality. And we don't have them because other folks work harder than us. I am the son of Milton Brown, 9th grade education. I lived in low-income housing as a small child. My father got a job as a steel worker at Wisconsin Steel. My daddy used to come home with burns on his arm. But because he got that union job, he was able to move us into a little 2-bedroom house on the south side of Chicago. And I thought we were the Jeffersons. I thought we was moving on up. So the work that we have to do now, if we are serious about waging war on poverty, is and there's a document I hope that you all get. It's this document right here, the Equity or Else Quality of Life Platform. We did listening projects and town hall meetings with tens of thousands of people in those communities. And we said, how has racism impacted you in education? What would you want to see? How has it impacted you in housing? And it's beautiful because one of the demands is rent control as a federal anti-gentrification strategy, directly from the ground. The Equity or Else Quality of Life agenda. There should be copies going around. And if you need, and we have a full agenda that is at www.standing4equity.org. And you can download for free the full document. Yes, sir. G2 Brown, J-I-T-U, last name Brown. Website www.standing4equity.org. So let me close with this. If we're serious about eradicating poverty, remember that quote I said in the beginning, no one is your friend who demands your silence or denies your right to grow. We have to hear what our people are experiencing. And then we have to make sure that people that guided by the people directly impacted, like Ella Baker taught us. Remember, Ella Baker taught us to avoid the hero worship. That all oppressed people, regardless of their level of education, have the ability to see the world they're in, understand their place in it, and move to transform it. And then remember what they did to Ella Baker, right? Remember how she was ostracized when she told people, stop the hero worship. But the students loved Ella Baker. They called her Fundi, which is Kiswahili for teacher. So we have to learn from when she did Freedom Summer, she told Bob Moses and them, you are students when you go into those people's homes. How are you going to teach, what you got to teach a man who can be murdered for standing up and saying, I got the right to vote, but he's brave enough to do it? Be a student on humanity. We have to be students again. We cannot get caught up in our titles and our positions and think that our stuff don't stink. It's important that if we're going to alleviate poverty, we start from the ground up. And so we humbly, I will say this too. I want to applaud President Biden. Let's give President Biden a round of applause. Give him some love. For too long, the biggest funder of the charter industry has been the federal government, even in other Democratic administrations. And on December 14th, 2019, we held the first ever presidential forum on education equity in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. President Biden committed to increasing support for community schools, and our funding went up for community schools from $32 million to $200 million in the federal budget. And now we are calling for, as Vice President Harris says, we can't go back. Y'all don't know about that. But the emergency funding, the elementary and secondary emergency relief fund that went out to several districts during COVID has to be maintained. We can't go back to dramatically underfunded schools. You can't educate children on the cheap. A society that does not invest in its young people betrays its young people. And remember this, So we have to stop the privatization of schools. We have to stop it. The charter industry, school choice was born out of white parents pulling their children out of the public schools after the passage of Brown versus Board. If the charter industry was really about you and me, then you would have seats on their governing board. On their governing board, 15 seats, there's only 2 parent seats. Equity begins with governance. Ain't that right, Julita? Equity begins with governance. So if we don't run it, it ain't for us. If you have institutions in your community and you don't have control on how those institutions operate, you have colonialism. And in black communities across the United States, we exist in a state of colonialism. People run their institutions based on their opinions of us, even though they get most of their swag from us. But anyway, all right, so thank you very much. If you all are interested, again, you can go to our website, and thank you for the opportunity. Appreciate it. Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay, so we know that Congressmember Danny Davis is stuck in traffic. And then we had one other speaker coming who has not shown up yet, and I don't know. I think that everybody's, hold on. Okay, I think that's it. I think we're going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Please join the Poverty Council if you can. I'll take a few questions. Thank you for that. Yeah, thank you for that. And we have some registration forms for you if you want to register as Democrat. Okay, you had a question? Great, thank you. I'm just calling the Congress member's office right now just to make sure he's not on his way. Okay, we got two more statements or questions, and then we're going to adjourn.
My name's Patrick Kelly. I've been a teacher for about 60 years, and I'm retired. And I want to thank you, sister, for bringing these guests and doing this stuff on poverty. And there's a lot of us from the labor movement. We know that the labor movement is probably the best way to transform people's lives and get them into a good spot. I want to unequivocally state that there's a hell of a lot of us Teamsters that are absolutely opposed to Trump. And I want to get that out there completely. You got it, sister. And I'm telling you, you saw the retirees that spoke the other night, and bless Joe Biden and those Democratic senators that stood up to protect our pensions and to do what needed to be done. This is the party of labor, and I don't care what kind of chip our leader has on his shoulder or whatever. This is the party of labor, and we, the people in this room, and the people in the labor movement, and the communities, are the ones that can bring it home to the people this fall. It's all turnout, it's all knock and drag. Sister, thank you for your leadership and having this.
All right, one more, and then we're going to adjourn.
I really do have a question, although I want to say, OSHA has proposed a rule to give water to workers from environmental concerns. And I will add to that it's direct shot. Talk about carbon and OSHA, yes, we certainly will support that. But another you're right. But to the Democrats trying to help. But the question I have
All right. We're gonna end with one comment from my colleague from California, Michelle Krug, and then I have to adjourn the meeting. All right, Michelle. Great. Thank you so much. Please continue the conversation. This meeting is adjourned.